Wars throughout history have been the backdrop of many incredible stories through the years. Today, we'll be exploring one which led to one of the great medical mysteries of all time. The story of Jacob Miller is an incredible one and still baffles to this day. On September 19, 1863, Private Jacob Miller found himself in the middle of the second bloodiest battle of the Civil War in America, the Battle of Chickamauga. He was serving with Company K, 9th Indiana Volunteer Infantry for the Union when he was shot in the head by a Confederate sniper near Brock Field. The bullet hit him dead in the center of the forehead, right between the eyes, and he instantly fell lifeless to the ground. His comrades, seeing that he was hit and the amount of blood caused by the injury, left him behind, believing he was dead, as the Confederates marched forward and the Union troops retreated. The following first-hand account of the aftermath was adapted by Luke Boserman from an interview Jacob Miller gave to his local newspaper almost 50 years after the incident in 1911. After being shot, Jacob says, "I was left for dead when my company fell back from that position. When I came to my senses sometimes after, I found I was in the rear of the Confederate line." Determined not to become a prisoner, Jacob got up using his gun as a staff and made his way through the Confederate troops and off the field of battle. "I suppose that I was so covered in blood that those I met did not notice that I was a Yankee." Jacob continued to walk until he struck an old byroad, which he followed. "By this time, my head was swelled so bad that my eyes were shut, and I could only see by raising the lid of my right eye with my finger and looking ahead, then going on until I ran afoul on something, then would look again, and so on." After a while, he became so exhausted that he laid down by the side of the road. This is when some bearers passing by saw him and put him in a stretcher, where they carried him to the field hospital. A hospital nurse came and put a wet bandage over my wound and around my head and gave me a canteen of water. The surgeons examined my wounds and decided it was best not to operate on me and give me more pain, as they said I wouldn't live much longer. So the nurse took me back to the tent and I slept during the night. The next morning, the doctors came around to make a list of the wounded, and they were sending all the wounded to Chattanooga in Tennessee. But they told me that I was wounded too badly and couldn't be moved. The doctors tried to assure Jacob by telling him that if he was left behind, he could be taken prisoner and later exchanged. The very thought of being a prisoner of war motivated Jacob. "I made up my mind as long as I could to drag one foot after the other. I got a nurse to fill my canteen with water so I could make an effort in getting as near to safety as possible. I got out of the tent without being noticed and got behind some wagons that stood near the road till I was safely away, having to open my eye with my finger to take bearings on the road. I went away from the boom of the cannon and the rattle of the musketry. I worked my way along the road as best as I could. At one time, I got off to the side of the road and bumped my head against a low-hanging limb. The shock toppled me over, but I got up and took my bearings again and went on as long as I could and dragged a foot, and then would lay down beside the road." Jacob didn't wait long until the wagons taking the wounded to Chattanooga began to pass by. One of the drivers stopped and asked me if I was alive, and said he would take me in, as one of his men had died back there anyways, and he had taken him out. Once inside the wagon, Jacob lost consciousness. The next day, Jacob awoke to find himself in Chattanooga. He was inside a long building, lying with hundreds of other wounded on the floor, almost as thick as hogs in a stock car. I raised myself to a sitting position, got my canteen, and wet my head. While doing it, I heard a couple of soldiers who were from my company. They couldn't believe it was me, as they thought they had left me for dead on the field. They came over to where I was and we visited together till an order came for all the wounded that could walk to start crossing the river on a pontoon bridge to the hospital. We were to be treated and taken to Nashville. I told the boys that if they could lead me, I could walk the distance. Jacob and his companions made their way to the bridge, but they found a long line of troops and artillery crossing it. They waited until almost sundown before they were able to go over. When we arrived across, we found our company teamster, who we stopped with that night. He got us something to eat. It was the first thing I tasted since Saturday morning, 2 days earlier. After we ate, we lay down on a pile of blankets, each fixed under the wagon, and rested pretty well as the Teamsters stayed awake until nearly early morning to keep our wounds moist with cool water from a nearby spring. The next morning, we awoke to the crackling of a campfire. While eating, an orderly rode up and asked if we were wounded. If so, we were to go back along the road to get our wounds dressed. So we bid the Teamsters goodbye and went to get our wounds attended to. That was the first time my wound was washed and dressed by a surgeon. After this, Jacob and his companions received supplies. A few crackers, some sugars, coffee, salt, and a cake of soap. Then they were sent by wagon to Bridgeport, Alabama. Jacob remembers the wagon ride. The jolting hurt my head so badly I could not stand it, so I had to get out. My comrades got out with me and we went on foot. They walked nearly 60 miles to Bridgeport, taking 4 days to get there. During the journey, Jacob was finally able to open his right eye without using his fingers. After finally arriving in Bridgeport, they caught a train to Nashville, Tennessee. The exertion of the journey and the pain from the wound had finally taken their toll on Jacob. He remembers laying down in the train car in a state of utter exhaustion. The sand had run out with me for the time being, he says. The next thing Jacob remembers, he was sitting in a tub of warm water in a hospital in Nashville. He was transferred from there to a hospital in Louisville, Kentucky, then to another in New Albany, Indiana. Jacob wanted the bullet to be removed, but in all the hospitals I was in, I begged the surgeons to operate on my head, but they all refused. After 9 months of suffering, Jacob finally got 2 doctors to agree to operate on his wound. They successfully took out the musket ball, and Jacob remained in the hospital until September 17, 1864. Jacob went home and resumed civilian life despite his open wound. The government awarded him a $40 per month pension, which enabled him to marry and even have a child. After the war, he also joined the Grand Army of the Republic. When he attended the encampments, his fellow war veterans nicknamed him Center Shot for the open bullet wound in his forehead. It was large enough to place the end of his little finger into the wound. Although he was well enough to continue living, the wound had taken its toll. He had lost the vision in his left eye. On top of this, he had bouts of side effects such as stupor for weeks. And when he was sick with a bad head cold, the pressure on his brain would build up and cause intense pains in his skull. The bouts of delirium would cause him to imagine that he was back on the picket duty again. It is said that the only time he felt at ease during this part of his life was when he was sleeping. 17 long years after he was injured, a buckshot dropped out of the wound, and then 31 years after, 2 pieces of lead came out of the wound. After his body had finally rejected these foreign objects from his skin, Jacob says that he finally felt release from the constant pain. He managed to regain his health and continued living his life until the old age of 87 years old. Jacob was living testimony to one of the most remarkable constitutions ever possessed by a human being. His obituary was published on January 14, 1927, and reads, "Funeral services for Jacobs Center Shot Miller, age 87, a well-known Civil War veteran, were held at a Presbyterian church in Braidwood, Illinois this afternoon. The Civil War veteran often visited Logansport. His nickname is significant because of the bullet wound which he had carried from the time of the war until his death. The wound was directly above the bridge of his nose and penetrated the skull." Thank you for watching today's video. If you enjoyed, please consider subscribing, and hopefully we will see you in the next one.